This is Politics and Media 101. I'm Jeff Browning. Fred Wellman is a graduate of West Point and Harvard Kennedy School, as well as the former executive director of the Lincoln Project, a super PAC that made some serious waves in the 2020 election cycle for its very punchy ads that targeted Republican voters with negative messages about Donald Trump. He has a lot of interesting perspectives on U.S. foreign policy, military deployments abroad, how politics drive those things, and on what's driving so many veterans to run for office. We spoke with him about all that, what's happening in Ukraine, extremism in the military, and more. Like all of our episodes, this is an edited version of a much longer conversation that was taped live with audience questions. For information on how to join us in past episodes, please visit our website, pm101.live. Please also take a second to subscribe on whichever podcast streaming service you're using right now so you don't miss our next episode on Friday featuring Olga Lautman, who's a researcher on corruption in Russia and Ukraine, as well as global organized crime. This interview was conducted by our co-founders Justin Higgins and John Gunnison. Without any further ado, let's roll the tape.
How honest is the military in the way they communicate to us? And I will be blunt. We had General Mark Kirtling on a while back, and we were discussing the Afghanistan drone strike that was errant. He was implying that without the New York Times investigative reporting, we may have not heard about it until 10, 20 years later. So from your experience, when you're watching maybe the news, CNN, MSNBC, Fox News on the Ukraine stuff, how big of a grain of salt do you take?
Well, that's a tricky question. I mean, I think for me, I became a public affairs officer because General Petraeus thought I did a good job. So I ended up on TV when we were in Iraq the first time. And I made the anchor cry on CNN one day, telling her a story about the Iraqis I was working with. I was conducting civil affairs in northern Iraq, helping build schools and villages. And so I became spokesman, and they train us. They train the spokesman to be always honest. They train them to be, what they call maximum information, minimum delay. In other words, our goal is to get information to the American people as fast as possible. But you get to those higher levels, and politics does intervene. And I saw it myself when I served. I think the greatest example I saw as a young officer was like the Pat Tillman episode, right? That was sort of covered up. I mean, when they figured it out very quickly, they sort of let the truth get blurry. And that blew up in their face years later. And I became obsessed with it. When I actually had a senior officer in my command in Iraq commit suicide. And I was deathly afraid that the same sort of narrative would occur and where it was covered up. And I was very direct with the casualty assistance officer at his base. I mean, look, you must tell the family he committed suicide. Well, we got to do an investigation. We know he was found in a locked room with his service weapon in his hand and a bullet through his head. There was no doubt that he committed suicide. And so what you do see, though, is sort of there's this hesitancy in the military to tell everything, much less than lying per se. I think what you see is, one, a factor of very, very tough information to find, right? There's a lot of classified things that go on. That drone strike is a perfect example. The information, the intelligence that led to the strike was probably classified all along. So how do you release information that's highly classified and do it in an unclassified way? Throw on top of that just the blurriness of war. Well, which drone strike was it? Do we know it was that one? I mean, war is very complicated.
Fred, I've got a question for you about how you served in Desert Storm. Of course, we had this situation where the U.S. was kind of in its unipolar moment, and two relatively small countries got in a war. We had one larger country trying to annex the other, invade the other, and the U.S. responded by intervening with military force. And now we're in a situation 30 years later where the status of the U.S. and the global order seems very different. And especially after 2003, there's so much reluctance to even consider using military force in a situation like this one. I don't mean this as a direct comparison to Russia. We're talking about a nuclear power. I'm not suggesting that Russia invading Ukraine is like Iraq invading Kuwait. But what if something like that happened today? Let's say Myanmar invaded Malaysia. Or someone like Saddam invaded Kuwait. Do you think that Desert Storm could happen today? Do you think the United States would consider actually militarily intervening in a similar situation?
I think with the Biden administration especially, possibly. I mean, we would do it as a coalition. The problem is we have kind of gotten burned. We didn't necessarily go it alone in Afghanistan. We definitely went it pretty close to alone in Iraq in 2003, right? It's kind of like post-Vietnam where we were hesitant about any kind of war. That was the thing about Desert Storm. We used to say that it broke the post-Vietnam malaise of the military where there was such hesitancy. If you remember, Colin Powell was the Powell Doctrine, which is if we're going to intervene, we're going to intervene and win. There's no question about it. I think you may see the same sort of thing now after Iraq and Afghanistan, after 20 years of the global war on terror. I mean, I don't know if there's an appetite in America for yet another war, right? So there is going to be this hesitancy amongst the leadership to do that. There's the logistic part of it. You got to realize we do not have the military we had in 1989, 1990. That was the Cold War military. I mean, we sent 600,000 troops to the Middle East to fight Desert Storm. When we did OIF, the Iraq invasion 2003, I think we used a third of that. And we got damn lucky, to be candid. We didn't use near the combat power that we used in the first one. So that's the next question is, what are our capabilities? I mean, the standing army, the standing military is not nearly as big as it was in 1989. So there are factors that the leadership and the political leadership is going to have to consider before we intervene in these things. Is what is our capability to actually accomplish the mission? Will we do too little? I mean, you could make the case that when we invaded Iraq in 2003, we did it much like you could almost argue that Putin watched our invasion and followed it and learned the wrong lessons. We basically did a regime takedown with minimal forces. We didn't control most of that land. It was a regime decapitation because the people didn't support Saddam. Now, if Saddam had popular support, if we had faced the kind of resistance that the Ukrainians are giving the Russians, it would have failed. I mean, there's just no way to say it wouldn't have. And you could argue that the reason we had a 20-year insurgency there is because we never had enough troops to occupy the country properly. We were spread too thin. We were all over the country. We weren't controlling every village. That was a myth. And so we didn't actually occupy Iraq to any great extent. So they were able to create an insurgency against us. So just like Ukraine, he did not send enough troops in to occupy Ukraine. To say he could occupy Ukraine is a myth. I don't know if we physically could, depending on the adversary. I don't know if the political will is there to commit ourselves to a war. And in the end, the final factor is, and I think our friends in Russia are saying right now, war, once it starts, nobody knows what's going to happen. You predict, you analyze, you do balances of power, you try to get intelligence on what the civilians are going to do. But in the end, it's a crapshoot, guys. I mean, honestly, you go into war, you're not sure what's going to happen. Things can get funny fast. I mean, everybody forgets the march to Baghdad was interrupted by a 2-day sandstorm. That kind of shut us down. I remember huddling in the middle of the desert underneath the Black Hawk, wishing the wind would stop blowing. And who could predict that, right? So war, it sounds good, the best laid plans, but once you engage, once you cross that line and things start getting blown up, all bets are off. And I think that's what Russia is seeing now in Ukraine, right? I mean, they had this great idea. They're going to rush in there and the people are going to collapse. And Zelensky, who's just a comedian, is going to flee the country. And the West, which is completely, fighting each other. Germany doesn't want to have defense. And Biden's weak because Trump told them that. And all that was wrong. I mean, we built an international coalition. The Ukrainians have fight in them and are fighting back. And so now here we are 2 weeks into a war that I'm positive Putin thought would be 3 or 4 days.
You talked about how in the 2003 Iraq war, the U.S. did not commit as many troops as they really needed to stabilize the country. Only 100,000 when maybe it should have been 600,000, like you said. However, in the years since then, it doesn't seem like that's the takeaway that our leaders have digested. Instead, the mantra has been no boots on the ground, right? So in these situations where the U.S. has become involved in Libya, in Syria, in Yemen, it's often been about supporting others, aerial, the drone war in South Asia. It's been this reluctance to really commit a larger true presence that could help stabilize any of these situations. So do you think that the U.S. has been approaching these situations wrong? Do you think that they've learned the wrong lessons from 2003? Or do you think that the public resistance to committing troops is an important enough reason to have the kind of restraint that they've been exercising?
That is the reason, right? I think the unforeseen circumstances of having, when we put boots on the ground, everybody expects us to fill it. Occupying Libya is a giant operation, occupying any country. So what we try to do is we support with the strengths that we have, which is a very technologically advanced military that can do very precise bombing. There's things we can do that no one else can do. And then what we want to see is the people who are there on the ground, like the Kurds in Syria or the Libyan freedom fighters where they were, depending on the day, do the fighting instead of using U.S. troops and getting us bogged down into a quagmire we can't see the end of. Again, there just isn't an unlimited supply of American troops. Again, I'll tell you, one of the things I've been saying quite a bit, guys, is I don't know if you know, but the one thing they teach us in the military, and probably everybody, and I was an international relations major in college, is the 4 tools of power in the United States. There's 4 tools of power. DIME, we call it DIME: diplomacy, informational, the military, and economic. Those are the 4 levers of international power that are available to a country. But you can honestly say that since 9/11 especially, it almost feels like the only one we've been using is M, right? I mean, it's just military. The only tool in the toolbox has been a hammer, right? And it was just a different size hammer. So it was maybe a small hammer, it was like drones. Maybe it was a big hammer. We invaded like Iraq.
Hasn't the most used tool been sanctions for the last 10 years?
Not in a combat situation. I don't think you've seen anything like we're seeing with Russia right now. The response to it wasn't necessarily a purely military one. We built, we can sanction alone, but to build an international coalition of sanctions has not been used that much.
I think that's been our approach to Iran and North Korea, hasn't it?
I would agree. Yeah, thank God. And diplomacy. We kind of went away from diplomacy a bit in this last administration. We're kind of going back to diplomacy. But I do think we're using at least all 4 pretty damn well with the Ukraine situation. I like seeing the full use. I like DIME. I don't want to just see military. 20 years of war is a really long time, guys. I mean, you got to remember, the global war on terror is the longest war in American history. It fought exclusively by a professional military. There was no draft. It was all volunteer military, which typically comes from their own military. I'm the son of a World War II veteran. My son joined. My son-in-law still serves. It was a long war on a very small segment of our population. And I think a lot of people are hesitant to join another war, for good and bad.
The number of veterans in Congress has declined significantly over the last several decades.
The way we can deal with some of the toxicity that we see within our politics right now is to recruit and actively support people who they were brought up and they were trained in this idea of saying we lead regardless of the politics that surrounds us. We want to endorse Republicans and Democrats. We want to bring people from various backgrounds, but the only common thread that they have is that they are military veterans and they pledge to be able to work with the other side in order to get things done. Right now, people are very frustrated by this level of not just confusion, but this level of stickiness and ugliness that our politics has now been able to exude. And the hope is that people who have worn the uniform and have worn the uniform with a core focus on supporting the country and its future are people that can help us break through that gridlock.
So speaking of our political leaders and how they approach matters of war, you mentioned John McCain a little earlier in this conversation. Mm-hmm. He was the last veteran that's been nominated for president by either party. And that came at the end of a streak of 5 consecutive elections, where a non-veteran beat a veteran in a general election. And since then, neither party has even bothered nominating one. Why do you think that the U.S., which so often elected veterans, Eisenhower, in the past, George Bush, has moved away from even considering veterans as candidates for president?
Part of it's laws of physics. There just aren't that many of us anymore. You have to remember that generation, the George H.W. Bush was a World War II vet. Up until the 70s, 80s, most of those guys were World War II vets and Korea vets. We're losing right now. Actually, that's out of date. We lost most of the Korea and the World War II veterans. They're just gone. When you had 25 million men under arms in that time frame, now, the total number of people who served in the 20-year global war on terror, I think, is just short of 6 million total in 20 years. That's not very many when you think the population of 330 million. So the veteran population has gone. I think 12 years ago when I started my company, Scout Comms, I believe there was 24 million veterans in America. Last time I checked, I think we just went under 16 million veterans in America, or 14 million. So it's just descending. Less than 7% of the population are veterans, and less than 1% of the population actually serves within the military in a modern sense. The average American doesn't even know somebody who serves.
I wanted to kind of take a turn to the dark side, both with GOP politics, Trump, and also veterans. And specifically, during January 6th, there were a lot of veterans that participated in this. And then taking it a little step further, you had, of the 147 Republicans that voted to support the big lie, some of them were veterans. So I guess just from your perspective, you're a veteran. How does one person go from supporting the country to either trying to militarily overthrow Congress or voting to support authoritarianism?
Well, wrap your head around the fact that on that day, 2 people died specifically, right? Brian Sicknick and Ashley Babbitt, right? They were both veterans. They're both Air Force veterans. So literally on both sides of the line at the U.S. Capitol on January 6th, there was veterans and service members. Did you know that an actual active duty service, a Marine field grade officer, a major in the United States Marine Corps, actually held one of the doors open and let people in? And he's actually serving in Quantico, Virginia. It's one of the reasons I started my super PAC called the Beer Hall Project, which is about the erasure of January 6th. And these are things we have to consider. We've been warning for years, the DoD, that there's a huge problem with a growth of extremists in the ranks. There's a growth of, hell, way back in the 80s, we were dealing with gang members, white supremacist gangs. I actually had to inspect my troops in the 1990s to look for white supremacist tattoos, which was a thing. It's probably one of the greatest disappointments that at one point, 10% of all those arrested and indicted for crimes on January 6th were veterans. As I mentioned earlier in this conversation, we make up less than 7% of the population, which means there was not just normally the representative amount of veterans, there was more veterans than we should be at that day. And that should scare everybody, and it should certainly scare DOD. Positively, I think they were. I think that Secretary Austin is taking it very seriously. He's been investigating, by the way, much to the chagrin of the Republican Party, who would beat him up for the woke training. But we need to understand that there are extremists in the ranks. When it's rooted out, when it's identified, they need to be kicked out. But no, it's probably one of the greatest disappointments of my adult life, to be honest, is to see so many of my peers who have turned to misinformation and deceived by disinformation and turned even to violence against their own government. I think if we don't answer those questions, the whys and how to prevent that, we could be in very serious trouble as a nation.
I don't know how I feel about the impact the Lincoln Project had, and I will tell you where I'm thinking, right? So on one side, I'm like, man, these ads are really rough and tumble, knock them down, drag them out. I personally really enjoyed watching these ads. I sent them to all my friends. I helped them go viral. And I'm like, well, maybe this is just getting lost in the noise and Trump derangement syndrome. But then I spoke to my next door neighbor who worked for the Trump administration relatively high up. And he said, he's from Georgia, he said that they were having an impact on the suburban voters. So I was wondering if you could give us a step back and an unvarnished take on the impact that you think the Lincoln Project had.
Well, I'm biased, but it's funny. So we gathered out in Utah, Park City. We gathered quietly in Park City for the campaign, the last part of the campaign. And some of my good friends from West Point live out there, and they're quite progressive. And I remember them kind of going off like, what are you doing? These ads don't make any sense, blah, blah, blah. And I said, you're not my audience. And they go, what do you like? I said, you're not my audience. We had a thing we called the Bannon line. And Steve Bannon helped us. He did a little speech one time. He said, look, these Lincoln Project guys, they're onto something. If they can peel off 3 to 4% of Republicans who voted for Trump last time, we lose. That's all. We were never trying to move 10% or 30%. We were never trying to move progressives. Our goal was, and the reason I did veterans, the reason we had a women's group, we had a Christian group, we had an evangelical group, was because we wanted to focus on these key constituencies, suburban women, to at least make just a few people who had voted for Trump either stay home or vote against him. And that's why you saw us talking about decency versus indecency, the values. I don't know if you guys, you probably didn't see it, maybe you did. I did now, the Vindmans. Rachel and Alex Vim are good friends of mine. I'm very fortunate to know them. And I recruited them to do an ad with me. And if you see it, you can look it up. It's on YouTube. It's called American Family is the name of the ad. I wrote that ad. Yeah, I wrote that ad. And I wrote it with Rachel's voice, right? Everybody knew Alex. They'd seen Alex on TV. But the real story was how Rachel Vindman, an Army wife, a loyal Army wife, 20 years had served with her husband in Russia, had served in Ukraine, had traveled the world, was with him as a partner when he got blown up in Iraq. And was now her family suddenly under attack, getting hate letters and having cameras in their front yard. The most powerful man in the world smearing her husband and her family. So I wanted to tell that story to target suburban women. I made it a story where any woman who is a mother and any kind of tiger mom would see her family being attacked by the most powerful man in the world and question that. And we got really great feedback. That was a really powerful ad with, again, suburban women, which was our target audience. And so we were part of a coalition, and we didn't just do ads. I think the big mistake a lot of people make is they think all we do is ads. We had billboards, we had media, we had a Latin coalition, a Latina coalition. I'm very proud of one of the largest Latina coalitions from groups that are heavily liberal that still worked with us, to partnerships with like, well, Midas Touch. We actually helped get door knockers for the Georgia Senate runoff. I mean, those are the things we did that weren't quite as spectacular that you saw on TV. But again, our goal was to reach and hopefully turn some 3 to 4% of Republicans that voted for Trump the last time. Did we succeed? Our numbers, some of the numbers, the more honest numbers have said yes. We've been attacked by everybody. That's okay. But I think for me, I definitely think we did. I mean, I saw a lot of people in my constituency, which is the veteran and military family group, say, yeah, that's just not our values. I can't vote for that guy again. It's just not, he doesn't share our values. And in a values driven organization like the military, that matters.
Well, yeah, of course. And I mean, you can't really parse election results that accurately, right? It's all guesswork at the end of the day. And to your point, Trump received much less of the vote than House Republicans, for example, who won back seats. So I guess I want to take a step further. The theory of the case is this negative campaigning, like you said, not necessarily to turn people to Democrats, maybe just make them not come out or get them so disgusted that they do come and they vote for that candidate, a very, very small percentage. I'm wondering if this type of negative campaigning for Democrats, we know it works for Republicans, but I'm wondering if this type of negative campaigning without Trump on the ballot actually works and why it might not or why it does work.
Well, that's the question, right? I think you look at Virginia, including my former organization, I think people made the mistake of trying and tie Glenn Youngkin to Trump, right? That was the big thing. He's just Trump in a vest. That was the big thing you heard a lot of, and people didn't buy it. I think there was this desire to carry on the Trump discussion to another candidate who had never served, never run for office before, so you didn't have a vote you could tie into any of that. So that instinct to try and tie Trump to everything was a mistake. I think that's a clear mistake that was made in Virginia, to include my former organization that wasn't a part of it at that time. But I would say in other places, you have to tie in the end. You have to tie it to your candidate. For example, let's talk Marjorie Taylor Greene and my friend Marcus Flowers. Marcus is running down in Georgia, Northwest Georgia. It's an R plus, 26 district, right? So obviously it's impossible for him to win. But Marjorie Taylor Greene is not your typical candidate. She's not Mitch McConnell. She is a first-term freshman Republican congressman who immediately was taken off all of her committees, has voted against almost every bill that would have benefited her district, literally every bill. She hasn't voted on it. I think she's voted for any bill that's passed, including the infrastructure bill. She spends most of her time gallivanting around the country with Matt Gaetz and others. This is rarely in the district. Doesn't even have an office in the district. She literally closed her office allegedly because of COVID, but has a PO box as her office in her district. I mean, that's how little she does for the district. So you could sit back and say, well, she's an incumbent, R plus 20. I said, what chance? Well, there is a chance because again, she has demonstrated that her values don't match those of her district. But I do urge my Democratic colleagues to, not be afraid of using some edge, calling out your opponent for the truth, using those hard messages. Because the thing is, no matter how great your policy is, it's useless if you don't win the election.
President Trump facing new fallout this morning after the bombshell guilty plea from his former lawyer, Mark Cohen, directly implicating Trump in campaign finance felonies. Trump took that on in a brand new interview on Fox.
Well, I guess it says something like high crimes and all. I don't know how you can impeach somebody who's done a great job.
Clearly, this topic is front and center on his mind. He was up in the middle of the night tweeting. He wrote, "No collusion, rigged witch hunt" at 1:10 this morning.
For some of us, the number one reason that we oppose Trump, even more than his ignorance, his incompetence, his prejudice, was corruption. We hated the fact that he was in the business of government and politics purely as a scam to make money. And we saw a lot of this in the campaign finance sphere, how the Trump campaign would put all of the money from the campaign over into outside consultancies and then take all of that money home in fees. And a lot of us are so frustrated by the way the entire campaign finance world operates after Citizens United. And so we look at, a lot of these outside groups, not just the Lincoln Project, but Midas Touch, which you also mentioned, and many of the other ones, we see a lack of transparency in the finances. And we sometimes wonder, is this a little bit of the same stuff that we're objecting to so much on the Trump side?
Yes.
Is that something that you can speak to?
How can I not say yes? Yes, absolutely. There's no question about that. Now I tell you this, the Lincoln Project, that was one of the things. So, I took over as executive director the day the John Weaver story came out. If you remember, on 1 February of last year, a story came out in the New York Times about John Weaver's just disgusting behavior with young men online. That was my first day as executive director, which was awesome, right? Great first day. And it only went cascading from there. Then there were stories about our financial stewardship and all. So we actually did a financial stewardship report. We didn't get any press for it. We actually tried to get the press to write a story about it, but they weren't interested. But we actually did a super PAC, which is never done ever, with an actual financial stewardship report. We laid out where the money went, where we spent it, who got it. We actually did a whole report. It's on there. It's on the Lincoln Project website. I was very proud of that. I stewarded. I was oversight of that myself. But that's a rare thing. You're right. Most of them, the way the rules are, they don't have to tell you where the money went. And it opens things like literally just now. I was reading a story. I don't know if you saw the story. Just came out about Sidney Powell, the Kraken lawyer, how she started this Defending America PAC or whatever. C4 organization. It's a 501c4, which is a dark money group that's raised like $15 million. And nobody has any idea where the money went. They're just making money hand over foot, her and Mike Flynn. Allegedly, they're funding the Oath Keepers' defenses. They're paying for the lawyers of the Oath Keepers. It's horrifying. So I actually, even a guy who works in that world as a super PAC guy, I do believe there should be more transparency. I'm here in Missouri where Peter Thiel has literally dropped Ohio. Peter Thiel dropped $10 million into a PAC backing JD Vance. $10 million. One guy is basically buying a candidate, buying a race, and he's going to use that money in the general just to mercilessly attack JD Vance's opponents. While all the campaign finance for JD, $2,700 per person. Meanwhile, Peter Thiel himself is dropping $10 million, and there's nothing that can stop him from doing it. I mean, it is a very, very broken system. Having said that, it's just like gerrymandering, right? It's okay for us to be. I'm against gerrymandering. I'm against Carly, but I'm also not going to sit back and let my enemy do it, me not do it, right? That's like surrender, right? And so it is important that we, as long as these rules are there, we have people who are willing to do the hard stuff on both sides of it. Otherwise, it's not an even fight. I mean, my God, the money is being raked in by the right now. Like I said, think about that: $15 million for one group. With no money, we have no idea where the money went. All of Trump's money that he's getting, we have no idea where it's going. He hasn't given any to any candidates. So where's the money going? At least the groups I know I work with, like Midas and Lincoln, they're spending on stuff. I know where Lincoln Project money is going. It went out the door to buy campaign ads and build them and build coalitions and pay for get out the vote efforts. But yeah, no, I mean, as a guy who works in that world, I agree. It's a mess. It's very dangerous, and that has changed our entire political landscape. Because again, if you just find one sponsor who wants to buy a candidate, well, here you go. Eric Greitens. Look at Eric Greitens, for God's sake.
I mean, it would be crazy if he wins that Senate seat. But
I'm here. It is crazy. There's a chance, and he'll win it with like 31% of the vote because none of the other characters want to leave, and it is a cast of freaking characters from Mr. McCloskey to Eric Schmidt, the Attorney General, who hasn't done anything for the Attorney General but sue schools, to Vicky Hartzler, who's trying to play herself as the reasonable one. She's actually like an anti-trans, Phyllis Schlafly style of far right insanity. And
Billy Long, the auctioneer.
Billy Long, oh my God, his freaking bust. Who's trying to destroy everybody, right? And none of them will drop out. So yeah, I mean, it's a very good chance Eric Greitens will walk into the Senate nomination because this isn't a runoff state. All you gotta do is get a simple majority. So he could get 31% of the vote and win the damn thing. It's horrifying.
And I just wanted to close the campaign finance law so that people don't get mad we're attacking Republicans. Rep. Omar's election campaign, according to the New York Post, helped keep her husband's political consulting firm afloat, providing nearly 80% of the company's income and spending over $2.9 million in the course of 2020. And folks, she is in a safe blue seat with no real primary challenger. So that kind of just speaks to the campaign finance. I don't want to call it corruption. You can draw your own inferences, but the system that is broken there. So I was wondering, Fred, if you're going to give us, you were a Republican, How does the Republican Party, you've now worked in politics for a few years, you've worked in communications for many more. How does the Republican Party save itself, or should everybody just vote for Democrats?
Yeah, I'm biased on that one. I mean, I don't know if it can save itself. I mean, there's been efforts to create new ones. There's been efforts to kind of return this to its more traditional conservative roots. Excuse me. I don't know if it's possible, guys. I mean, I would love to be an optimist. I mean, we need two strong parties. We need a reasonable alternative. But when you see the kind of activity going on right now with the Ukraine stuff, where they just refuse to give the president any support at all, they're going to attack Putin and attack Biden. I mean, it's just there's just insanity on one side, and it's not normal. There's just this great desire for us to return to normal, like the good old days, right? We see it in the media, we see it everywhere. We even see it amongst the Biden administration. Why do you want to be normal? When one party's just not normal anymore, I don't know the answer. I'm not necessarily sure they're going to fund themselves in the woods. My view has been, and my colleagues at the Lincoln Project when I was there, was that the Republican Party kind of needs to be put out into the woods for a while, put out into the wilderness, and they must go out into the wilderness and find themselves, like the old days, right? They need to go on a vision quest to figure out who the hell they are, because right now we don't have a party that should be trusted with government. We just don't. When you see today, I mean, look at just today, my God, the anti-trans activities going on in Texas, the law in Iowa that's actually is it Iowa? Yeah, Idaho. They're trying to make it illegal even for a family to leave the state to get gender affirming care for their transgender child. In Missouri, a woman today introduced a piece of legislation just yesterday that if a woman gets an abortion in Illinois, that she can be sued. The whole bounty thing, $10,000 sued because she killed she's a Missouri resident, but she went somewhere else to kill a baby. This kind of insanity is really a march to autocracy, which is scary to talk about, but it really is. These kind of rules where using child protective services to go after families that don't say gay law. I mean, you're seeing some really crazy stuff coming out of these legislatures, many of them super majorities, that tell you we have a party that's not interested in governing all people. They're not interested in the best interest of all people. They're interested in their only constituency. And when a government becomes ruled by people who are only interested in their specific constituency, well, that's an autocracy. That's what Saddam did. Saddam took care of the Sunnis only, not the Shia and the Kurds, but just the Sunnis. That's a horrifying situation. I mean, say what you will about my colleagues in the Democrat Party, which I was not a member of for the majority of my life. I think they usually try to at least do the best thing for all Americans. And even my Republicans used to. They try to do the best thing for most Americans. I'm not necessarily sure I'm seeing the same thing anymore. So I got to tell you, just Mr. Operative thinks that I think the Republican Party needs to be put in the wilderness. We need vote Democrat, get the best candidates possible. We have a big tent. Here in Missouri, we need whoever is the strongest candidate that could beat Eric Greitens needs to run and win. We need to support him. We need to hold our nose sometimes and just, they got a D, just vote for him, because that's all they're doing. They just never vote for anybody but an R. That's how Winsome Sears won the lieutenant governor's race in Virginia. She's nutty as hell. I mean, it's just not. She's just something. She's something. But they just went straight R ticket, and all three of them got elected. So I think it's a very weird time. We are not going back to normal anytime soon.
Well, that's, I think, quite a unfortunate omen then to end this part of the conversation. But perhaps it's a bit of reality. Well, we're going to go to our audience member up here. Duke has joined the stage. We want to check to see if Duke has a question to ask. Duke, over to you, sir.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Justin, for hosting the room. Fred, glad to have you here. You spoke of having to engage with the super PACs because the other side has been doing this. And is there any concern from your end with this constant financial arms race with the current composition of the Supreme Court where there's not much hope to change Citizens United? So do you worry that the landscapes of campaigns and elections, the amount of money that's in it, has enabled, strategists to micro-target voters in such a way that it's fundamentally changed, the elections? Do you have any concern for the future of democracy?
Oh, I have 100%. Yeah, you're right on target. And not just the money part of it, the way we have, like you said, the way we've divided and the way we can spread misinformation just so quickly and so laser targeted, the manipulation of information, the information environment we live in. But no, I do. I do. I believe that the way that we've structured our elections, that it's so far from what the founding fathers had in mind, which was anyway, because it needed to. But it is. We're getting very close to not really having representative democracy. I do fear for our democracy. I'm not. I think we're too. There's an element of hubris in the United States that the bad things that happen in Germany, the bad things that happen in other countries will just never happen here. We're too good for it. But I think this is such a hubristic view. Certainly it can happen. There's nothing wrong with those other countries that somehow they're weaker or less than us. They're all the factors that turned Germany or Italy into fascist states could very much occur here. Why not? Why do we think we're special, that we're so different? One of the things my organization focuses on, the Beer Hall Project. We call it the Beer Hall Project because of the Beer Hall push. In October 1923 or April 1923, Munich, Hitler tried to take over the government of Bavaria and then marched to Berlin, modeling his friend Benito Mussolini. It failed. But what he learned was, that wasn't the way to power. He would just manipulate the levers of power of the Weimar Republic and take power through the ostensibly democratic means. 10 years later, Hitler was the chancellor. A month later was the Reichstag fire. A month later was the enabling acts that turned him into a dictator. And we know what happened after that. And so I do believe that this is what we have to remember, is that since January 6th, the Republican Party especially has been doing all they can to roll back voter. You saw it in Texas in the primary. People going to vote and they weren't even on the rolls anymore. They'd been removed. Even though they'd voted in the very last election, they were removed from the rolls for no good reason. All the absentee ballots being rejected, basically. So you're seeing efforts by our opponents to try and manipulate our electoral process, and all that's occurring. It's scary to me that we think that we could not find ourselves in a position of an autocratic state. So I spend every day of my life right now focused on that issue of what can we do to stop the march of time. It is campaign finance money. It is the gerrymandering. It is the way we've set in stone who everybody is, and we're building districts around always winning those districts. People giving up entire states. Missouri is worthless because it's a red state. Well, there's a lot of good people here. So no, I think it's a great question. I wish I had the answer. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, one of the things my organization is trying to do is answer that question. Well, I think there's estimates, Duke, that 27% of Americans are completely politically unengaged. We talk about right, left, independent. I'm talking about I don't know what the hell I am people who are just not participating in our democratic system. How do we get those 27% of Americans to understand that even when they're focused on economic issues, an autocracy is not good for the economy? Ask Russia about that today. How's that working out for Russia, right? And so how do we activate them? It's one of the questions I want to answer is how do I reach those people who aren't involved and make sure they're participating in our democratic process before it's too late, before there is no democratic process?
Thank you very much, Duke. I think that is a fantastic note to end on, Fred. So I just want to say that in about a week, we will publish this into a podcast. We will send you the link for some Twitter love, get as many listeners as we can to it. But before we end, I just really quickly, we got like 2 minutes left. I was wondering if you had any last thoughts. It sounded like that was some pretty good last thoughts there, but I wanted to kick it to you just for the final thoughts here.
No, thanks. I appreciate it. If people want to follow me on Twitter, it's FP Wellman. I'm FP Wellman on everything. I do believe that we have the ability to participate in this. I think people ask me all the time, like, what difference can I make, Fred? I'm, vote. I said, well, if you look what's happening, like a lot of these election boards, a good friend of mine just got put on his local election board. It's a nonpartisan thing, but there's a lot of people who, Trump himself has said that it doesn't matter what the vote is, it matters who counts it, which has been misattributed to Stalin, but it is what it is. I think you could participate in our democracy. Show up at your city council race. There's been some really crazy stuff happening in those places. Show up at your school boards, because the march to that failure that we talked about, Duke, the march to the failure of our democracy is at the local level. It really is at the local level. It's in your school boards. It's in your city councils. It's in your county councils. It's in the state legislatures. Too many Americans don't even pay attention to those. And then you wake up one day and you've got laws passed, like here in Missouri, where they passed a Second Amendment law where essentially the police are not allowed to participate in any kind of gun programs. And they inadvertently defunded the state police because they got pulled out of a federal task force that was funding like a third of their money. The ironic thing here in Missouri is the Republicans inadvertently defunded the police. If you want to stop those kind of things, it really is happening at your local level. I always urge people, if the opportunity presents itself, please participate in your democratic process right in your own backyard. You don't have to spend a lot of money. You just have to show up sometimes. So That's the big thing I tell everybody is, get involved before it's too late.
That's all we have for you today. Again, huge thanks to Fred Wellman, to our audience for their questions, and to you for being here. Like all of our episodes, this is an edited version of a much longer conversation that was taped live with audience questions. For information about how to join us, past episodes, and more, please visit our website, pm101.live. Please also take a second to subscribe on whichever streaming service you're using right now so you don't miss our next episode on Monday, featuring Olga Lautman, who's a researcher on corruption in Russia and Ukraine, as well as global organized crime. This has been Politics and Media 101, produced in partnership with Clubhouse. I'm Jeff Browning. On behalf of Justin Higgins, our co-founder, and our team, thank you very much for being here. We hope to see you and hear from you soon.